Welcome to lesson 7.13. In this lesson, we will cover the essential role that herbivorous or root-feeding nematodes play in soil ecosystems. So up until now, we have been looking at the damage that these nematodes cause in agricultural systems, and now we'll look at their actual role, which plays an important part of a healthy ecosystem. All right, so let's jump into lesson 7.13. So out of 30,000 so far identified or classified nematodes, about 4,000 species are plant parasitic, and that constitutes about 15% of all the described nematode species in the soil. So obviously, plant parasitic nematodes are not a huge number in comparison to the extensive population of nematodes in the soil. But they do affect plant productivity as well as resource allocation. So that means like exudates being allocated from the plant to the nematodes, as well as rhizosphere deposits. So that means what does the plant put out as a result of having a root-feeding nematode on its roots? The plant puts out different secretions, such as plant secondary protective substances, and that increases production and competitive advantage or disadvantage of the host plant. They also regulate plant defense versus herbivory. So if a nematode is munching on a root, this stimulates the plant to defend itself, and those defense mechanisms might also defend the plant from other herbivores, and that might include above ground, not just the root system. And they also, on a larger scale, regulate changes in plant communities as a result of all of the above effects that herbivorous nematodes have on plants. So before we focus on the role of root-feeding or plant parasitic nematodes in the soil ecosystem, let's re-examine the roles that nematodes play in terms of nematodes being functional groups in the soil ecosystem. Because as a community, nematodes actually increase plant nutrition and plant biomass as well. So nematode functional groups link below and above ground processes under resource-rich conditions. And this is a study that was done in 2016 that you can have a look at. And first of all, the most plant-connected nematodes are actually plant parasitic nematodes or root-feeding nematodes. So what root herbivory does is it actually stimulates root exudation. So it causes sugars from the plant to leak out as the herbivores feed on plants, specifically root tissue. And this causes this efflux of exudates out of the plant. And this automatically feeds the bacteria and fungi in the soil. So it stimulates microbial growth as a result of this exudation from the plant that is stimulated by root-feeding nematodes. And then what bacteria and fungi do is they accumulate nitrogen and phosphorus and other minerals from the soil organic matter and the fresh organic matter that is being decomposed by them, as well as from the bioavailable pool that is present in the soil matrix. And this, of course, feeds the bacteria and fungi further and in turn stimulates reproduction of bacterial-feeding nematodes, and of course fungivores, nematodes that feed on fungi, and then the omnivores, because the omnivores then feed on the bacterivores and the fungivores, as well as the other creatures that are present in the soil. So you can see in this diagram the role that herbivorous nematodes play in the soil ecosystem because of their very intimate relationship with plants. And now we can jump into examining this relationship further, the dynamics between plant parasitic nematodes or herbivorous nematodes and plant growth and plant community development. So now we have learned that herbivorous nematodes increase the leakage of rhizo deposits into the soil, and that increases microbial growth. And in this particular study, the authors applied low carbon to nitrogen ratio grass clover as carbon and nitrogen source and documented an increased rhizo deposition and noticed this increased microbial growth and activity as a result of carbon and nitrogen provided by nutrient-rich organic amendments. This stimulated an increase in microbivorous nematodes and that, in effect, increased plant available nutrients and plant biomass production. So they've concluded that nematodes significantly increase plant biomass production, as well as nitrogen and phosphorus availability to plants. So what these authors found was that plants actually benefit from low-level infestation in balanced nematode communities. They found that 93 plant parasitic nematodes applied as an initial inoculation onto a plant allowed these nematodes to increase up to 620 plant parasitic nematodes per plant, but this was still below the economic damage threshold. And they found an increased active microbial biomass and nutrient availability in the presence of plant parasitic nematodes at the density of 25 to 69 of a single species per plant. So, for example, a sedentary endoparasitic nematode such as Malidogine increases enzymatic organic matter decomposition by using the enzymes that it has in order to disintegrate plant tissue, and it increases plant biomass as a result, as well as nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium concentrations. So what the authors concluded is that nematodes link organic matter decomposition and plant biomass productivity via increased nutrient availability to the plant. So this is where we are stressing that at healthy numbers of plant parasitic nematodes, or herbivorous nematodes, it is actually beneficial for the soil ecosystem and the plants to actually have these nematodes on their roots. And what's happening with this nematomonium instead of a pandemonium is that we're trying to get rid of all of these beneficial organisms. They are beneficial. They're just completely out of balance in ecosystems that are completely impoverished through current agricultural practices. So when the soil ecosystem and the plants are brought back to health through appropriate feeding of the soil and the plant ecosystem, and the rebalancing of all the microbial biomass and the nematodes populations, these organisms play a vital role in plant health. And this is particularly true for natural ecosystems where these nematodes don't go out of balance and are a part of that ecosystem to which they beneficially contribute. So nematodes affect vegetation composition. And given that they are the most abundant, functionally diverse, and key animals affecting plant performance, there is very little knowledge of plant-nematode interactions in natural systems. So this needs to be increased. And this paper here that came out in 2020 describes some of the dynamics that go on in natural ecosystems in terms of the interaction between nematodes and vegetation. And of course, root-feeding nematodes or herbivorous nematodes can have a direct negative effect on plants, as well as an indirect positive effect when they are predated upon. And this significantly drives vegetation dynamics. They provide increased plant-soil interactions, being at the interface between a plant and the soil matrix. They also play a role in plant invasion dynamics, so how plants become predominant in certain ecosystems, as well as increasing the understanding of sustainable plant management. Because without knowledge of this very important component of the soil ecosystem and its interaction with plants and vegetation composition, we are unable to understand their role as well as their importance in driving that composition of a particular vegetation type. And of course, climate change alters plant-nematode interactions, and this will have an effect on future vegetation. So once again, understanding how nematode communities change, particularly under climate pressure, gives us a window into what's going to happen in ecosystems and various vegetation types by understanding the role that these nematodes actually play in those ecosystems. So in order to study the interaction between plants and herbivorous nematodes and other nematodes, there are specific indices related to the nematode community in the soil. Soil disturbance for example, intense agricultural management decreases higher trophic level, slow-growing nematodes, such as the omnivores and the predators. So through being able to assess the numbers of omnivores and predators in the ecosystem gives us an indication of the health of the soil ecosystem. So we know that tillage reduces fungal hyphae, and that reduces, therefore, fungivorous nematodes. And this increases fast-growing bacterivores as it turns the soil and changes the microbial dynamics in the soil. And this favors fast-growing bacterivores and therefore reducing maturity and structure index of that soil nematode community. Growing plants in monoculture increases herbivorous versus other groups of nematodes. And that's because now there is an abundant food source where there are no obstacles for the nematodes to get to, and particularly in conventionally grown systems that are plowed and also chemicals are applied to the soil will minimize plant health and therefore increase susceptibility of these plants to herbivorous nematodes. So therefore, soil health matrices, such as the indices that examine nematode communities in soils, can be used to determine plant performance in a given soil ecosystem. So let's now look at the relationship between root-feeding nematodes and plant soil feedbacks. So plants have their specific rhizobiome that is determined via structural and chemical root traits. And this determines plant performance and subsequent plant generations. So there are negative versus positive plant soil feedbacks via antagonistic versus mutualistic soil organisms. So the negative soil feedbacks are, for example, when there is a root-feeding nematode infestation, and plant positive soil feedback happens when the plant has only mutualistic or beneficial organisms within its rhizobiome. However, negative plant soil feedback leads to vegetation succession and determines grassland dynamics and also whether crop rotation might be needed in an agricultural system. So each plant also has specific plant defense traits, such as species-specific root exudates, volatiles that it produces, specific targeted resistance responses that a plant might have, as well as microbes that help to suppress infestation by nematodes, for example. And this leads to the accumulation of specialists, so nematodes that feed specifically on a particular plant family or particular plant species. And this is limited by a particular host range and usually favors endoparasites, or it might lead to accumulation of generalists, so nematodes that have a wide host range and include both endoparasites and ectoparasites. So let's look at specialists versus generalists. So specialist nematodes are confined to low diversity plant communities, such as coastal dune grasslands, for example. And these guys terminate dominant plant species and allow for non-host plant establishment. Because when there is low diversity, such as is present in agricultural soils or in coastal dune grasslands, when these nematodes take over, they basically have a party with these plants. They consume quite a lot to the detriment of the plant species that is dominant, and then this reduces that dominance of those plants, and therefore through the process of natural succession, new plants come in that are not host to these nematodes, and this allows the establishment of a new plant community. So species-rich plant communities have increased host ranges, and therefore they increase generalist functional importance versus specialists, which rely on reduced host availability. So rely on a specific family of plants or specific species of plants only for their survival. Fast-growing annual species increased generalist numbers as opposed to longer-lived plants that increase their investment in defense against the nematodes. So root-feeding nematodes or herbivorous nematodes really drive this successional changeover from ephemeral, fast-growing, fast-reproducing plants to establishing stable grassland communities. Generalists such as Melodorga and Hapla, when inoculated onto diverse plant communities shows a variability in its numbers across closely related grassland species, and this is due to plant-soil feedback variations within specific plant communities. So really what this is saying is that herbivorous nematodes play an important function in driving plant community dynamics and plant succession. And then within each plant community, there will be variations within specific plant-soil feedbacks. So these nematodes have different effects within different plant communities, depending on the entire ecosystem and how they interact with that ecosystem and the plants within that given community. So let's look at the role of root-feeding nematodes in plant-soil feedbacks and its relationship to natural succession. So basically, at reduced plant diversity, where we have early colonizers or agricultural crops, specialist root feeders negatively impact dominant plant species. And since oftentimes there's only one dominant plant species in these ecosystems, these specialist root feeders have a significant impact on these plants, and this leads to primary succession and eventually to species-rich grasslands, as shown here. And we can see here that in agricultural crops, there is an effect of both generalist root feeders as well as specialist root feeders. And in abandoned agricultural fields, the ecosystem undergoes secondary succession, where ephemeral or transient plant communities take over. And now that there's some diversity, generalists will have an effect on these plants, increasing generalist numbers as well as vegetation turnover. And this eventually leads to diverse grassland communities. There's also plant-specific defense, which leads to species-specific accumulation and variation in the nematode contribution to negative plant-soil feedbacks. So it is thought that generalists may contribute to plant species spatial turnover and vegetation dynamics. And as this successional process takes place, there is an increase in nematode community maturity at increasing trophic levels, and this increases predation on root-feeding nematodes by omnivorous and predatory nematodes. So as succession increases, as you can see here, predatory and omnivorous nematodes increase in number, so that increases the maturity index of the ecosystem. The ratio of fungivorous to bacterivorous nematodes increases, and also the ratio of generalists to specialist root feeders increases as well. And of course, there are also indirect benefits of root-feeding nematodes. So at low abundance, there is an increase in plant exudation, and we've already covered this at the beginning of the lesson, and therefore microbial activity, and therefore increased nitrogen and phosphorus availability to the plants in the soil ecosystem. This stimulates increased bacterivore population and therefore plant nutrition and growth, as well as for allowing an abundance of easily available carbon rhizodeposition. And bacterial nitrogen becomes increased by 20% and phosphorus by 75% due to this increase in bacterivore numbers, and that of course increases plant nutrient uptake. Plus this also stimulates bacterivorous protist numbers, increasing root branching and nitrogen uptake, and therefore plant performance. And this is particularly important in nutrient-limited soils. So basically this describes the indirect benefits of root-feeding nematodes as they feed on plants, allowing more nutrient accessibility to the plant through all these interactions that other organisms take part in as a result of this increased root exudation via the root-feeding nematodes. And of course, root-feeding nematodes are also a food source for nematophagous fungi. And so as these fungi consume root-feeding nematodes, they increase in abundance, and that stimulates fungal-feeding nematode populations to increase. And this leads to omnivores and predators also increasing in their populations. And once again, this increases nutrient availability and plant growth. And of course, overall, there is a control effect on the root-feeding nematodes as a result. So when the ecosystem is in balance and root-feeding nematodes are present in the proportions that they are meant to be present in the ecosystem, this provides conditions for other nematode groups to exist, and therefore it keeps the root-feeding nematodes in balance as a result. So these are the beautiful ecosystem dynamics that we need to understand, and we need to also appreciate. And through this understanding, we can create conditions that mimic these natural systems in our agricultural systems, so we no longer have to fight the imbalance that results where the ecosystem is unhealthy, the plants are suffering, and therefore there's an explosion of these root-feeding nematodes that we then only view as plant parasites and only view as something to destroy and remove from the ecosystem, whereas in effect they are a healthy part of the ecosystem. It's just that it goes out of balance whenever we put pressures on the ecosystem and create unhealthy conditions and unsustainable conditions for plant growth and balanced ecosystem function. Okay, so we have come to the end of lesson 7.13, and in our next lesson we will stress the importance of soil organic matter and its effects on root-feeding nematodes. So you'll be hearing from me again in lesson 7.14. Bye for now.